get started here. So my name is Brian Teeter. I'm the Prescout Fire Coordinator with Nebraska Pheasants Forever. Today we're just going to kind of go over on how to make kind of a your basic prescribed burn plan. For doing your burns. We'll talk a little bit about some advanced stuff, but these are kind of the basics that we utilize in our burn planning for our burns. This is being recorded. We'll have this up on our YouTube channel for a later date if you want to refer back to it. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So what we're going to talk about, the expectations for this workshop, hopefully understand the role and needs of prescribed burn plan. We're going to talk about the steps in creating that burn plan, and then talk a little bit about map making, go through some examples of maps and burn plans, and then talk a little bit about some of the mistakes people use or people do when creating a burn plan. So one of the things that we talk about is, a lot of times a barrier of writing your own burn plan can prevent people from doing it. There are resources out there that are available to help write these burn plans. A lot of natural resource staff through Pheasants Forever, NRCS, Nature Conservancy, Game and Parks, a lot of different people out there that are willing to kind of help write your plan. The good thing about prescribed burn plans is a lot of it is kind of just cut and paste some of the information or plug in the information to certain burn plans. But there's these things that you gotta walk through some of these steps to ensure that the fire on the landscape that you're putting on the landscape is going to be done in a safe manner with some forethought ahead of you. Now, if you're outside of Nebraska, I don't know if anybody's outside of Nebraska here, but if you're outside of Nebraska, some of this stuff may about our state statute and laws and stuff like that may not pertain to you. But even then, it's always good to have a prescribed burn in place. I know some states don't require them, but they're always a good thing to put together before you actually do a prescribed burn. So what is our prescribed burns? Our prescribed burns are basically, our burn plans are basically a documentation of who, what, when, where, why, and how we're going to do a prescribed burn. So it's really important that we put it all together in a nice plan. So we're planning ahead. We know exactly what we need the day of, what weather conditions, all those things. Now, there's a lot of different templates that you can use across the state, across the country. I've seen burn plan templates that are 4 pages long. And I've also seen some that are like 50 pages long that require a lot more information. And just because there's more information on a burn plan doesn't mean it's actually safer. So, writing a simple burn plan that gets to the point and has all the information you need on there will suffice just fine. So it could be very basic, like we'll talk about today, and then you can also get more complexity depending on, if you work for an agency, sometimes you have very specific things that you need to do. So basically, these templates force us to think through all the different factors before we're putting fire on the ground. So we're looking at different hazards, what are our objectives, what type of equipment do we need, all those things are recorded on these plans. And these we do it for 2 reasons, right? It can actually act as a record for future burns or land managers. It can be required by a state statute, agency, local fire departments. But again, it's about prescribed fire safety. So, the stat that, 99.2% of the burns on the landscape are successful without incident. And those 99.2% of those burns all pretty much are going to have a prescribed burn plan on them. So these burn plans are basically showing that we're acting with care, caution, and intent, right? So if you think about from a legal standpoint, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not acting like one, but if you think about from a legal standpoint, if you're being sued and you don't have a prescribed burn plan that shows the steps and forethought that go into to your burn, it's going to be a lot easier for somebody to sue you and say, well, they just went out and lit a fire. They didn't know what they were doing. So putting together a burn plan basically shows you that you're doing it with care, caution, and intent. And it's really all about safety, right? Safety is the number one aspect that we talk about and utilize every fire that we're doing. And I always talk about there's 1,001 ways to write a burn plan. This is very true. We have a large staff here in Nebraska. They all write burn plans, pretty much all write burn plans. And everybody has their kind of individualized style, right? And so that style can be based on who taught them. That style could be based on the agency and organization that they're working for, or who's approving them, or their local needs, like the volunteer fire department, fire chief, or something may want something very specific to fall on there. So there's really no right way or wrong way to write a burn plan, because there's a lot of different ways, and everybody has their own. You got to be a little aware of overdoing a simple plan. Like if you're just doing a 100-acre burn and it's flat, square, don't overdo it and complicate it more than it needs to be. We want the basic level of information in there that needs to be included for safety and for state statute purposes. And if you need to go above and beyond, you certainly can. But too much information in there is sometimes not good either. And like I said before, many times a lot of this language can be kind of copy and pasted with additional local details in the templates, and we'll kind of discuss a little bit about that as well. And writing burn plans takes practice. It can be very frustrating if you sit down and try to do a prescribed burn plan the first time and kind of get overwhelmed with the amount of information and the things that you need to put in there. So, the more burn plans that you write, the more comfortable you're going to become with them. And so if you're just starting to write prescribed burn plans, start with simple burns and work towards more complexity. And the other thing is when you're writing a burn plan, it's always useful, obviously, to have burn experience, because your burn experience is going to dictate the information and the fire breaks and the width of them and location of them. All that's going to kind of determine, based on your level of comfortability of writing a burn plan. So don't ask help, or don't be afraid to ask for help reviewing those burn plans with more experienced burners. So if you write a burn plan, ship it off to somebody and say, hey, can you take a look at this for me? Review it, see, have some comments on it. So don't be afraid. And you always learn by doing. So the more you write, the more you're going to learn, and your style will evolve over time. When I started writing burn plans, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, my style has changed completely different. And my style even changes from, basic CRB burn to like a rangeland burn. So let's talk a little bit about state statutes. So in Nebraska, prescribed fire is regulated by the legislature. There's a couple of state statutes that directly pertain to it. So currently there's a statewide open burning ban on all bonfires, rubbish fires, and fires for the purpose of clearing land. So essentially that there's a burn ban at all times, 365 days a year. The only people that can get out of that burn ban would basically be the local fire chief or local volunteer fire department designee. And so they can waive it in their jurisdiction. They have full control over prescribed fire in their district. The state can't shut them down. The emergency managers can't shut them down. The fire chief in that district has full authority on when they cannot issue, when they're going to issue burn permits. So in order to get that burn permit, you need to have several things. Burn plan, and then there are certain things that need to be in that burn plan. But if you go out and light a fire without a burn permit, you can be charged with a class 4 misdemeanor currently and fined between $100 and $500 for that. So in the state statute, it also says you shall notify the fire chief prior to starting your burn. I've looked, this is interpreted several different ways by different fire chiefs and fire departments. Many times the notification to the fire chief prior to starting the burn is when you get the burn permit. Others want you, they'll give you a burn permit, but then they want you to call you, the day of your burn. Say they give you a 30-day permit, they want you to call the day of the burn. It kind of varies across the board, so it's always good to talk to them prior to going through your burn plan and all that stuff. So a permit for land management burning can be issued only if the land management burning is conducted with this according to state statute. And according to the state statute, you got to submit an application for a burn permit. And that application for that permit is essentially a burn plan. And so that burn plan that we'll talk about needs to be submitted. If you do not submit a burn plan prior to getting a burn permit, and you go out and do a prescribed fire, technically you're going to be outside of your prescription or outside of the state statute. So you're basically illegally burning. So then once you submit that burn plan, the fire chief basically evaluates the plan, determine its compliance with the state statute. And if that plan complies with the statute and is going to be conducted with due regard for safety of people, property, outside the burn unit, the burn permit should be issued. And this is pretty important too. No permit is valid for longer than 30 days. So essentially that means that if a fire department chief writes you a permit for 35 days or 40 days, say no thanks, I'll take one for 30 days. There's a lot of different fire departments. Sometimes you have fire departments that will issue a 30-day permit, especially into people that they know, like our prescribed burn associations or game and parks or whomever. And then a lot of times they'll only issue the permit for the day, and that's like, they're based on weather conditions. So, they know that, they can kind of control when that burn's going to happen based on weather and stuff like that. And these burn templates are available through a bunch of different sources. Many conservation organizations have them. Many states, their game, Nebraska game and parks, they have these kind of templates that they use. I try to use, one that's really simple, and we'll talk about it. But these burn plan templates must have a certain number of things on them in order to comply with the state statute. And here is just a couple. Here are some of them on there, or all of them. The name of the landowner, the land the burn occurs, name of the person that's going to supervise the land management if it's different than the landowner, the land management objective to be accomplished. So right there, those things are like super easy, right? In our template, we're just basically going to plug and play those in. And then we also need a map showing the areas to be burned, including natural and man-made fire breaks. And then procedures used to confine the fire within those boundaries without pre-existing fire breaks. We'll talk about map making in a little bit, and we'll go through some of this. And then a list of equipment that will be on hand. And then the types and conditions of the vegetative matter to be burned on the land and in adjacent areas, followed by identification of roads and habitations that may be affected by smoke. And then pretty important, the difference between wildfire and prescribed fires, we get to choose our weather conditions. So they basically say that you put in a description of your weather conditions that are going to be required to safely and successfully conduct land management burning, including wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity. And because it's government, they basically say any other information that the fire chief or local fire department wants. And this literally can be anything. So this is why it's important to contact the fire chief prior to burning. So you can ask them, is there anything you want beyond the state statute? And we've run into this several times where the fire chief wants something very specific in a burn plan in order to approve it. And so, just save yourself those steps and ask them prior to writing your burn plan if they need anything. Sometimes they'll even supply you with a template they like using. So a statutorily minimum burn plan is pretty simple, and almost any landowner really can produce one. We typically go a little above and beyond what's normally required by state statute, just to add more information in there for our benefit and for safety. And we'll talk about some of those after a while. So now we'll kind of get into the steps in the planning, and I break it down basically: pre-scouting, site visit, inventory, writing your plan, reviewing the plan, and then going through a final review and site confirmation. And the how much time it takes to go through these steps is always going to depend on complexity, and how long it's going to take. Right? For a simple CRP burn, you could probably knock this out, real easily in half a day or less. For more complex, like rangeland burns and lots of cedar trees, this process may take months, to kind of go through these processes, go through all of it to get it kind of figured out. So if you're planning a burn, starting this burn plan as early as possible is important, because as we'll see, a lot of times there's changes that need to be made along the way. So the first thing I do when I'm doing a pre-scout of a prescribed burn is I pull up an aerial photo of the burn. And you can do this on Google Maps pretty easily, right? You just pull it up, look at the site. You can also use things like LiDAR and elevation, and we'll show kind of examples of that here in a little bit too. But basically pulling up photos, be sure to include areas adjacent to that planned burn unit. Just to have kind of more perspective what the surrounding landscape is, because as you remember in our plan or in the state statute, it says they have to kind of figure out what the surrounding adjacent vegetation is. So you'll want to put that on there, and then print out several copies as well to make extra notes on. First thing I do is begin by drawing out what your desired burn boundary looks like. And that could be very simple. Just, draw a line around, okay, here's what I want to burn. And then you'll start documenting, things about that burn unit and the adjacent areas. So what's the vegetation look like on site, off site, right? Does the pasture to the north or east, does it graze down really hard, or was it deferred the year prior? Mark down any visible buildings or infrastructure that you can kind of see. And also within several miles, especially when we're our offsite smoke will go places. So, start identifying those areas. Any existing roads and trails of those areas, just mark those down. Any known history of the site, has it been burned before? Has it been grazed? Has it been deferred? Just jotting those things down in your pre-scout makes it easier for when you actually get out on site. Then you of course want to gather details about site ownership and location. Obviously if you're the landowner, name, your contact information, county, section, township, range. All these things are going to be plugged into your burn plan, and you can gather a lot of these details prior to ever leaving your house. And then, of course, you want to define your objective. Like, what is your primary reason for burning? A lot of times it can just be as simple as ecosystem maintenance, or it could be even beyond that, where you could talk about wildland fuels reduction, control of eastern red cedar, improving forage. It can be multiple things, but you don't need to get overly specific on your objectives if you don't want to. And it can be multiple things, for that reason. But having an objective is really important too, because your objective, your burn parameters are basically going to be defined by your objectives of what you're trying to accomplish. So it's important to define those, because your weather parameters are going to be completely different for control of eastern red cedar than it would be for just a ecosystem maintenance burn. Next thing I do is I do a site visit. Typically, depending on how complex it is, plan on spending at least an entire day, going around the unit, double checking things. if it's a small burn, you're not going to maybe spend that much time there. If you're working with a landowner, plan on spending time alone um, with the burn. It's easy to, what I found is when I go around a unit with a landowner, it's important, right, to have them, but also it's good to just drive around the unit yourself and kind of look at things without the kind of distraction of having somebody talking about it. But working with the landowner is also really important, and having them drive you around the unit. The first thing I always do is have them, jump in the UTV or truck, and we'll go around the unit. And I'm sitting there taking notes while they're talking. Oh, there's, a big hole there, there's a big rut there, there's water over there. There's a lot of information that they're going to be able to provide to you, for that reason. Some of the things that I ask when I'm out there is, okay, are there any hard to reach areas or trouble spots, right? Is there, a big hole or old dump site in there? What the relationship is with neighboring property owners. This is really important. So, when you're planning like a wind direction or something like that, if you have a neighbor that absolutely just does not like you or does not want any kind of smoke or anything on them, those things are good to know so you can put that into the planning process. Also, what type of equipment they have access to, whether it's tractors or skid steers, do they have any pumpers, drip torches, any kind of equipment like that, because we'll need that for our state statute burn plan as well. Talk about access to water, any kind of stock tanks, hydrants, or water tenders, just to be thinking about that. Water is really important, so having access to those and knowing where those are important. And then also just any other known hazards, right? Is there a pipeline running around or running through the property? Any deer stands that are vulnerable to fire? That one hole that everybody always has that gets people in trouble. I always ask a couple other questions too. I talk about how they feel about their fences. Typically, most of the time we burn through fences and we have no damage. Other times we'll have damages to fences. So talking about basically setting their expectations that hey, may lose a few posts here and there, to kind of gauge their level of how worried they are about their fences. And then anything else that would severely impact site in the near future, right? If there's any kind of drought, are they planning on cutting any trees or altering the property before the burn? We've had this happen multiple times where we go out and plan a burn, and then they will go out and prior to the burn, we'll write the burn plan a year in advance, and then prior to the burn, they go out and cut a bunch of trees. And so now we got a bunch of burn piles and things of that nature that weren't in the existing plan. And then things like, are they going to defer grazing, right? That's going to change our fuel load as well. And then I'll do an inventory of the property, and I like to do this without the landowner. Just kind of have the opportunity to objectively view it, without the biases of the landowner that are there. Depending on site complexity, I'll use ATV, UTV to ground. But a lot of times it's always good to drive a truck around it because you're going to typically drive a truck around a unit with a pumper anyway. So having the opportunity to drive that truck around there is good. Then the first thing I do when I do look at the boundary initial walkthrough landowners is I look at it and say, does this need to be adjusted? Many times landowners will come to me and say, here, I want to burn this pasture or burn this field. And they're thinking it's like, this piece. And a lot of times we can basically adjust that boundary to include more ground, or maybe it needs to include less ground to make it safer. So, think about that, after the initial inventory, talking to the landowner, maybe their neighbor is open to burning. So we can say, okay, we can cut off this finger, or we can remove this grove of trees, or include this grove of trees, things of that nature, to say this would make it easier for burning. Then once any boundary change is looked at, you can kind of proceed with that inventory. And I like to look at, even if they don't say, even if you don't expand the unit or, what have you, it's always good to just think about those things while you're doing your inventory. So you kind of think about, so you don't have to go back out, look at it. Here's a really good example of that. This is what a rangeland burn. Landowner came to us, the equip contract saying, here's the piece that we want to burn. And you got roads on the east side, south side, and north and west side over there. You can see that, there's goes right through a grove of trees. Well, the landowner owned the property just to the west of it as well. And so by a very simple boundary change, you kind of see the original one ran right through the ditch there, or the drainage, and then we moved it up on top of the hill. So that slight shift right there made this burn so much safer. And then on top of it, we killed a bunch more cedar trees that were in that northwest corner over there. And this is what a LiDAR photo is. If you're not familiar with LiDAR, these are really invaluable tools to utilize when planning burns, especially from afar. It makes it really simple to see the elevation changes on the property. And you can download, I'm not sure if there's really a good public site that you can find these. We use it through GIS, but so a detailed inventory, include all those things, known issues, jotting down those notes of those locations, what needs to be done to mitigate or fix those risks. And then another good thing to do is also take pictures. Take pictures will help you remind you of what needs to be done, and give you a detailed information about those, fresher memory. Another thing to do in the inventory is make sure you do a detailed analysis of the vegetation along the boundary and about 300 foot on either side. Document what the type of vegetation is, what the condition is. Is it dormant? Is there a lot of a lot of high fuels, a lot of tall grass, things like that? Any brush piles or anything like that in those areas? Document any kind of vehicle access issues. Again, driving around the unit, you're going to need to know that. Document areas that are like real steep or washout, or any areas that need dirt work, to improve that access. And then document where the gates and access points are, right? That's why we detailed, have those maps. We can just put those on there. Bunch of different other things, any hay bales, roads, 2 tracks, basically anything that you see out there that could potentially impact your burn is what you want to, take a look at. So once you've completed your scouting, the initial site visit, you're going to basically take this information and put it into a format that is organized and readable to your audience, which is going to be your fire chief. So again, most states have resources for these burn plans. Give me 1 second. I gotta let my dog out. All right, sorry about that. So if you can do a simple basic burn plan that meets your needs, make sure to do that. So here's just a couple examples that we have here in Nebraska that we utilize. Here's one that Spring Creek Audubon uses. It's a really simple document. I think it's like 3 or 4 pages, but it's basically got everything on there that complies with state statute. Here's a generic template as well. The stuff highlighted in yellow are ones that are basically comply with state statute. And then this is the one I like using. It's the old 2008 version of the NRCS burn plan. It's 7 pages, but it's a lot of plug and play information on there. And then NRCS does have an updated one too, where it has more information on there. But again, a lot of it's just kind of plug and play or click on there to utilize as well. So again, like I said, most of these templates are pretty easy because you just basically plug and play the information that's on there. But there are others that require a lot more thought and planning for that information. So some of the easy plug and play information is general site information, contact information. A lot of those different things are just easy and going to be plugging right in right away. But some of the things that require a little bit more thought are, your weather parameters. For example, the thing about weather parameters is that you want to have a range of acceptable conditions to burn safely, but you also want to meet your objectives. So if you think about, you're trying to kill cedar trees and you're trying to burn with 60% humidity, well, it's probably not going to do a very good job of killing your cedar trees. But the other thing to think about too is you don't want to put yourself in a bind by using really narrow parameters, because Nebraska, we just don't get enough days where we're going to have good burn window opportunities. So you basically need to give yourself every opportunity to burn, still trying to maintain those objectives as well. So if you can burn with 25% humidity all the way up to 70% humidity and still accomplish your objectives, do that. But think about if you're outside of your burn parameters, you're going to be out of prescription. So make sure that you're putting in parameters that you're able to stick to. Now, if you are going out and burning and say your bottom limit of humidity is going to be 25%, and you go out and burn and you start the day, it's 40% and drops all the way down to 20%. Technically, you're going to be out of prescription, but there's really not much you can do at that point because you're going to be 3/4 or almost done with your burn. So you can't just like shut down the fire and stop because you're out of prescription. It's more about when you're starting starting that burn within your prescription. You can't, if the planned humidity is supposed to go down to 20, then maybe it's not a good idea to burn if that planned humidity is going to be below that, because a lot of times it's going to take longer to do a burn than you think it's going to. Then always when you're planning for wind directions, when you're talking about weather, plan for dominant wind directions. Sometimes the site will allow us to burn with like any wind direction so you can remain flexible. But a lot of times there's very specific wind directions that you have to burn with, whether it's because of smoke or roads or fuels or what have you. But the dominant wind directions that we're going to see in Nebraska for good burn weather is typically going to be from the south in the springtime. Now, you may get, like in the springtime, you may get north winds, northwest, north, northeast, but those are essentially, most of those in the springtime are going to be associated with either cold or wet. So you can plan those burns with north winds if you are doing like a maintenance burn, but many times you got to plan with more of the southwest wind directions, southwest, southeast wind directions to do a good job of meeting your objectives, especially when you're killing cedar trees. The other thing that requires a lot of thought too is about your equipment needs list. And this is basically a list of just what kind of equipment do we need to be present to safely burn. And so if it's listed on your burn plan, it needs to be on site in order to be within prescription. So if you write in there that you're going to need 3 pumpers and you only show up with 2, then you're out of prescription and you should not burn. So, make sure that you put the minimum number of equipment that you need, and then you can also bring more. So just put the minimum that you have and need, and you can always bring more to supplement what you have. If you're working with somebody that you're not sure what kind of equipment they have, make sure you know or ask them what kind of equipment that they have, because if you write in there that you need 200-gallon pumper units and they've only got 150-gallon pumper units, then theoretically you're going to be out of prescription. You would be. Another thing, we'll show this later, but the firing method, ignition plan, this is how we're basically going to contain the burn, what we're going to do. In the burn plan, there's an area that you can write this stuff out. And there's really 2 schools of thought that can be used on this. One is just a general description of how it's going to be burned. So basically something like, we're going to be using a ring fire technique, laying down wet line, using strip fires, and then using the ring around the unit. Just a general description on how it's all going to be contained. And then there's another school of thought where they go into more of like a detailed analysis of how to do the actual firing method. And this step basically involves kind of doing a step-by-step or play-by-play on how it should be burned. I don't really like that type of language in there because it's too detailed, right? If you have to be that detailed on how to burn something, you probably shouldn't be out there burning it or be in charge of burning it. And it also can put you in a bind. So typically when if I do a detailed description burn, I'll write in there that this is just a basic guide and should not be followed, to the T. Another thing that we put in there that's not a state statute, but we list the crew assignments. So we list the general job description. So like how many, we got 1 burn boss, and then how many crew bosses, how many igniters, how many drivers, how many hose operators. And then the day of the burn, when we're doing our burn, is we'll actually fill in those names when people show up with their equipment. Because we never know who's going to be showing up to our burns. And so, or most of the time, we get a good idea, but we'll fill out that. We'll just put the crew assignments, general job descriptions in there and fill out the names later. And then also we'll put in there areas needing special protection, and we'll spell out what needs to be done. And this just is a list to hold people accountable, hold yourself accountable prior to burning. So if you need to rake around a house or use a weed whacker around power poles or burnout areas, put that stuff in there, and we can basically use it as a checklist. And you can include a time frame in there. So like I want my fire breaks need to be done by a certain date, or the weed eater around the power poles, or what have you needs to be done by a certain date. And that's pretty important, especially from a fire break standpoint. We want fire breaks put in as early as possible. And then we also had a couple other things in our plans. We talk about smoke management. We put in there how long a burn should last, just to kind of give people time frame of like this burn is going to maybe take 3 or 4 hours. Then we look up how many people are going to be affected and make sure we contact them prior to burning. It's a courtesy thing. We don't want to be smoking out neighbors and stuff without them knowing about it ahead of time. Most people, in rural Nebraska are pretty used to prescribed fires and smoke, and they understand why we're doing it. But it's always good to contact them prior to. And then we'll put a mop-up plan in place. This is, where we talk about what are we going to do? Like, how far from the fire line do we need to clean up? Does a harrow need to be out there to drag, harrow cow pies after a burn? And then of course, who's going to like do the monitoring afterwards, for 24 to 48 hours after the burn, make sure, if the wind comes up the next day. The last thing that we'll typically do is sometimes we'll write a contingency plan of, okay, what happens if the fire gets out? And, it's very rare that you're ever going to need your contingency plan. And the reason why we put the contingency plan in there is twofold. One, if it happens, we have the plan. But two, it forces you to think about prior to it happening. So the burn boss and the fire chief, they basically have an idea of if something does happen, what's your plan? What's our fallback? Are there fire breaks? Communication plans to the fire department? Roads that we can burn off. Something that happens. Again, it's very rare that fire gets out, but when it does, you want to make sure you have some sort of plan. They'll put in if there's a wind shift. This is a pretty common thing to put in, but we should not be burning within 12 to 24 hours of a major wind shift. And the reason why, if anybody's ever been to our basic workshops, is it's just when they on the hourly weather graph, they typically have, okay, the wind's going to shift at like 5 o'clock today or something like that. Well, it's obviously the future and they can't predict it. So that storm system that's making that wind shift, it could speed up and maybe arrive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you could be, just finishing a burn and boom, all of a sudden you have a wind shift. Or it could be leaving later, either way. But if it happens earlier, it's usually when people get in trouble. So there's several ways to make a map. If you're a landowner and you're just doing your own, I've seen these hand drawn on a map. Print off, Google, 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17 sheet of paper, or get something from the USDA office. You can literally just go and hand draw it on a map with a Sharpie or colored pencils or what have you. When I got a bunch of sets of like colored Sharpies, and we've had landowners write up their own burn plans during our workshops or in-person workshops. I've seen people use Microsoft Word. They can basically paste a picture in there, and they can insert shapes, drawing tab, or on the drawing tab. I don't use this, and if you do know how to use it, that's great. We got one gentleman that uses like a free Adobe PDF thing that he uses to do kind of the same thing. What we use, and our staff uses on Pheasants Forever and NRCS, we use ArcGIS. It's a little more, it's complex, but if you're doing a lot of burn plans, it's really easy to make these maps. But there's nothing wrong with hand drawing it. As long as you have all the state statute minimum stuff that you need, hand draw it. If you're going to do hand drawing or any kind of making maps, it's always good to have a legend on there of information, right? So, if you have your staging area or your burn unit, make sure that stuff is labeled so people actually know what it is. So our maps basically would contain, basically simple information, right? Our burn unit, where's our fire breaks, roads, what's our access, vegetation, wind direction, all those different things. On some of the maps that we make, things can get very easily crowded, and so we typically make multiple different maps just to kind of keep things from being too bunched up. So basically, I make 4 different maps usually with my burns. I do a fire break and hazards map. That's essentially what are my fire breaks, what are my hazards, my safety zones, access, all those different things that are on there, any steep areas. Then I'll do a separate one that's an ignition plan map, where basically we have routes that crews are going to take, and interior ignition that we're going to be doing, as well as any safety zones, things of that. And those are the kind of stuff that we hand out prior to burning. And then we'll do a 2-mile map. So basically a 2-mile map over your burn, just to kind of give a sense of the surrounding landscape. And then a contingency plan map. I always say you want to map things that are going to remain static. And so things that aren't like, obviously a gate access or gate let down, they're not going to change typically. But if you got like tender locations, maybe not mark those on there because, they're harder to move. I mean, obviously if you're doing your briefing, you can go in there, exit out and say, okay, we move this tender over here. But it's just easier to mark all the things that are kind of going to remain static and not move. And then kind of once you get put together this plan, a very big thing, a good thing to do is have somebody review it. So sending it out to somebody saying, hey, what do you think about this plan? Is there anything I missed? And it's a good thing to do because just like when you're doing any kind of project at work or something like that, it's easy to miss something when you're so much time invested in a project. It's easy to miss like little things. And so having somebody review that is a good idea. And the other thing I'll do too is, kind of once we get a final burn plan put together, we'll do another site visit to just make sure nothing has changed out there. When reviewing a burn plan, somebody can always find an issue with the burn plan. You send me a burn plan, I don't care whose it is, I can find something that I don't like about it. Or, and that's the thing is you need to determine whether that it's a personal preference issue or it's critical to safely burning. So when a staff member sends me their burn plan for review, I may like, oh, I don't like, the way they did this, but it works and it's not, critical to safely burning by modifying it. And then modify the plan if needed. I would say, on some of the bigger burns that we do, you probably go through 2-3 iterations of a burn plan before, it gets finalized. With a CRP burn plan, you can knock those out pretty easily because they're typically on flatter terrain. Don't have big cedar trees or something like that. And then, of course, depending on your circumstances, you may need somebody to sign off on that burn plan. Typically the fire chief they're going to sign off on it by giving you a burn permit. But if you work for, Pheasants Forever and RCS, they basically require like a second signature for that. All right, so this is just a basic burn plan. We'll just kind of go through real quick and talk about it. This is the 2008 version of the NRCS burn plan. Again, this stuff at the top, all this information is just kind of plug and play, right? This is just basic facts and information. What are your objectives? Any management needed to accomplish before burning? So like no grazing or haying for at least a year. After burn, who's going to be the burn boss? Types and dimensions of fire break. So here's where you would basically go in and add, okay, we're basically going to have mode fire break around the entire unit. It's going to be 30 foot wide. It's either going to be hayed or baled off site or shredded well in advance to break down thatch, things of that nature. And this could be different. You could have a burn plan where, on the north side, you have a different fire break than you do on the south side or east side. So you can go out and actually spell those out on what different sides that you have for that. And then the firing method, again, you can kind of read that if you want right here, but basically this is where we just talk about what's the firing method that we're going to use to contain this burn. And it's very simple, our ring fire technique, strip head firing, wet lines, all that stuff. And this basically gives the burn boss leeway to basically burn with any direction of wind that they feel comfortable with. Now we'll see in our weather parameters that there are maybe some winds that we can't burn with, but you want to basically kind of remain fairly broad on how we're utilizing our firing method. Now, if you went in and said, we're going to, use a southwest wind and start at point A, and crew one's going to go south to point B, while crew 2 goes to point F or something like that. You get very, very, very specific on how to do it, but again, I don't recommend doing that. And then a contingency plan, if it jumps the fire break or there's a wind direction change. Again, this is basically, it's all going to be kind of dependent on, your fuels and surrounding vegetation on what all that's going to be. Then smoke management, again, what's our estimated time of ignition? Where are we going to find that information about smoke? The weather service, your mixing height, things of that nature. And then in here, they got places for your equipment. Remember, this one is part of state statute, so that has to be in there. So, put in how many are needed, 200-gallon pumper units, how many drip torches, how much drip torch fuel do you need, drinking water, any sprayers, flags for highways, rakes, ATVs, basically just all the minimum amount that you need in there. And again, this is kind of complicated for some. It's like, okay, how much equipment do I actually need? And again, that comes with experience of, doing the burns, right? So if you've never been on a burn, it's pretty hard to write a burn plan based on the equipment. Then areas that you need protection. So if you had any utility poles, you'd write, okay, they need to be weed eated around them. Or any kind of fences, maybe there's a lot of fuel on the fence line and you need to go out, at the wood posts, maybe you need to go around those. Just basically have the information in there and what needs to happen in order to protect it in the future. And then here's where our crew names, responsibility of each person. Again, we'd only fill this out on the day of the burn. But what we'll go in and do is typically put in the crew or the positions. So burn boss, and then we got 2 crews. So on those 2 crews, each crew has a driver, pumper, igniter, and ATV or UTV. And then the day of the burn, we'll basically go in and fill in that information. Projected dates of burn and time of burn, just like put in your dates. Almost every burn that I write is from January 1st to December 31st, and that's because many times we're burning the same piece, multiple years, and so we recycle the burn plan for that. And also, there's 365 days in the year, so we're going to use every one of those days to burn to meet our objectives. Some fire chiefs, want a prescribed burn to be lit between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. Others don't care. I've seen other fire chiefs say, if you want to start a prescribed burn at midnight, go for it. But many want to kind of stay within that time frame from 9 to 6 p.m. Have it lit. It doesn't mean you need to have it out, but they want it lit between those hours. And here's where we put our weather parameters. So when you're thinking about weather parameters, like I said, remember you want to be wide enough to accomplish your, wide enough, but narrow enough to accomplish your objectives. In this burn plan, we're basically doing a maintenance burn on range land, been deferred for a year. And so we kind of get away with different parameters than most. But here we got 5 to 20 miles an hour, which is a pretty standard for prescribed fires in Nebraska, about 5 to 20 miles an hour. Put in wind direction, so we list out every wind direction that we can burn this unit with. Even if it's every wind direction, I still spell it out with all those wind directions. Relative humidity, what's our relative humidity? 20 to 60% is typically what I'm using. Most of our, I would say, 75% of our prescribed burns here in Nebraska occur from 20 to 35% probably. Most of those burns are actually happening. We did a grassland burn. It's an old CRP that burned for like 5 years. We burned it with like 90% humidity, and it actually was freezing drizzle out, so it actually still burned pretty good. So put that in there. And then air temperature, typically 50 to 80, 50 to 90 degrees is typically what we're going to be burning with. Again, you can go down from, just above freezing, 32 to 80 degrees or something like that if you can burn. If you want to burn when it's freezing out, there's obviously different things you're gonna have to think about there is you're gonna have pumps that are gonna freeze, right? Water freeze in your pumper units. But I've seen it done. This burn plan has different stuff in here about moisture in the surface or subsoil, also fuels and stuff like that. This is kind of like an NRCS thing, but it's not required by state statute. But it is, good information to have if you're burning in like a wetland. You may need that prescribed burn to have a dry soil surface and subsurface in order to get a burn across it. So just things to think about for that. Again, here's the another thing, adjoining landowners. So basically the landowner names and their phone numbers. This is a courtesy contact to say, hey, I typically say, well, my neighbors already know that I burn every spring, but typically like the week of, I'll call them and say, hey, we're planning on burning this week. And they're like, all right, thanks. And then this other information on here about, volunteer fire department number, sheriff's number. And again, most of the time, those are all just going to be 911. The volunteer fire department, they're not at the station unless there's a fire or after a fire. So you can call them all you want, but they're probably not going to answer in an emergency. You can list their phone number on there, fire chief's phone number. I typically put that on there as contact information. Same with the sheriff. And then any utility companies to call as well. And then basically here is just a really simple map, what we typically would do on a pretty simple burn. You can see we put our wind directions that we can burn with. We've got a place where our water source is, so that's where our water tank's going to be. We have our access points listed, so that's how you access the burn unit. There's surrounding houses around there. And then the burn unit is identified with our type of fire break around the entire unit. So you can see that it's basically just a mode fire break around it. Now, if you had, different fire break and natural fire break or something on that, you could add that on there as well. But the other thing that we added onto this map too is just what's the type and condition of the surrounding vegetation. This is really important, right? Dormant ungrazed pasture with cedar trees, dormant ungrazed pasture oak trees, all these, dormant crop stubble. And you can even go in and mention if it's bean or corn stubble. So it's a really, really simple burn. I mean, this is basically all you really need in order to comply with state statute. And typically we'll add another 2-mile map, again, just kind of showing the broader context of where it's located, just to get the fire chief, context of where you're at if they don't know necessarily exactly where it's at. And then I would say, when you're putting together a burn plan, the most mistakes that I see when people are doing it is a couple of different things. They fail to put the types and conditions of the vegetated matter to be burned on the land in adjacent areas. They forget to identify roads and habitations affected by smoke. And then they also fail to identify the equipment they have access to. So this would be just like, the standard, we have 2 200-gallon pumper units. Well, we got one 200-gallon pumper unit and one 150-gallon pumper unit. So just, going through that equipment list to make sure you know what equipment that you actually have. The other thing that we really like doing, going back to that map, is putting drop points all along the outside in critical locations, like at certain bends or corners. And I use A, B, C, D, E. You can use 1, 2, 3, or whatever you want to use. The reason why I use A, B, C, D, E is because I'll put those points on there, but if there's areas that we need to fill in, like say, hey, we need to add another drop point here, you can just do A1 or B1 or B2 and just add those spots on there. And the other thing to think about too is don't leave any blank spots on your burn plan. So if there's a blank spot, just put NA, right? Not applicable. Because a blank spot, would signal to somebody like, oh, did they miss this information? Was this information important, but they forgot it? And so just put on there that's not applicable. And then, of course, check for any spelling errors when you're doing it. All right, so we're just going to go through a couple other maps and plans and just talk a little bit about, the kind of different, some of these maps are really complex, but you can see the kind of different things. So on this map, you can see that, they have a natural fire break on the east and south side here that's identified. These are roads. We got mode fire break here in the green on the west side and north side. And then there's areas on here you can kind of see where they put that there was a dozer fire break. So they actually had a dozer come in and put a doze line in there to clear the trees and stuff off the fence line through that area to make it safe. But you can see they've got safety zone, staging area, water source right here. They've got the types and conditions of fuel around it. Got houses identified. Really good map for a burn like this. And then here's kind of an ignition plan map. They basically wanted to burn this with a north or northwest wind. You can see basically, they start down here in the corner. One crew going this way, one crew going this way. Then they have a 2 mile map or that broad scale view map as well, showing different houses and stuff like that. And then contingency lines of these roads. Here's another map that's really good. You can see there's a lot of information on this map. So if you're producing a complicated map, it's always good to have different symbols and layers and stuff like to utilize. But you can see they got the burn unit identified, staging areas, surrounding vegetation. They got areas that are impassable. We got trails, creeks in there that you can't pass. So all this good information that are on there. So this map was one that was burned last spring, and this was the original burn unit line. And then you see as on that west side there, they had this trail identified that basically went up on top of this ridge over here. And they're already burning these people's properties, and so basically we moved it off top of this ridge, and it made the burn so much safer because they didn't have to kind of go weave in and out of these canyons, which is really kind of steep and stuff. Even though this area wasn't deferred over here, it didn't burn super great. It just made the burn that much safer. And you can see that change was reflected in the next burn plan there. So you can see they moved it on the outside here. And this was burned with a southeast wind. So everything was being pushed from the bottom right up. Another really simple burn plan. You can see they've got, disc fire breaks along the crop field, mode fire breaks. You see they've identified like a pond, wet areas where the fence needs to be let down, areas that are really wet. So you don't want to have people go through, take off through there and drive and get stuck. Then you get another ignition map. Two-mile map. Again, same thing with this one. These are one of these things where these maps are, my personal preference on some of these things. This map is a little too crowded for me. It's hard to see these staging areas or safety zones, the stopping points, to kind of make sure that these are, cleaned up more so you can actually read the symbols and stuff like that. But another good example, of a good clean map that would be fine. Got the roads identified, surrounding vegetation. Same thing here. These are just all different examples of different maps that you can put together. Here's a good example of a really busy map. You know, it's got a lot of great information on there, but there's just a lot of information happening on, so it's hard to determine kind of um, where the burn unit is. It's hard to identify. So we're kind of cleaning it up, making it a little more um, presentable is always a good thing. And all that stuff can be basically, you know, hand drawn on a map pretty easily. You know, it takes a little bit of time to do that, but you can easily put that on there. Does anybody have any questions? Throw them in the chat or unmute yourself. No questions so far. Okay. So we're almost done here. I just want to mention, you know, next week we'll be doing a webinar on how to use this GIS mapping platform. If anybody would be interested in using that, but it's pretty cool that you can very easily plan a prescribed burn. Here's a unit that we're going to be burning this spring. It's a kind of oak savanna restoration that we've been working on for a couple of years. It's a small unit because we got a bunch of cedar trees and stuff around that we're still working on cleaning up. But we can very easily plan these burns. You know, create a map for what we need on these areas to plan. You know, we can easily add our access points on there. We can add fire breaks. Oops, missed the wrong one there. So yeah, we can use this to kind of map. And so if you're writing a lot of burn plans, it's really easy, but we have this template that you can use to set up. But other than that, you know, you could basically use, you know, just hand draw this stuff on here as well, which makes it really, really simple to do at home. You know, we can even add our drop points on here. Add staging areas, all sorts of different stuff on here to do it. So I believe next week on the 24th will be that workshop. So if you want to join in for that, that'd be cool too. And then if anybody is interested, I believe the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Council has got on their website, there'll be some burn plan templates on there too if you want to download them. I'm not sure if they're up yet. I think they're supposed to be uploaded sometime this week. So sometime this week, if you go to the Nebraska or anyfirecouncil.org, there'll be burn plans on there that you can easily use and download as a template and fill in on your own. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to kind of look over your burn plans or reach out to one of our biologists across the state, whether it's Pheasants Forever, Game and Parks, TNC, or whatever. We're all happy to take a look at your burn plans and review them for you, or even help you write them. So. If NRCS is asking for their burn plan, it's best to use their templates. Yeah, so if you're burning any kind of like CRP or equip, especially if you're burning with the equip contract, you have to have an NRCS burn plan. CRP, it's kind of different offices require different things. I've seen some offices with CRP utilize, the extension template. Some offices will want the NRCS template. So if you're burning CRP, I would ask before using a specific template. But with equip or NRCS program, they will require NRCS burn plan template to be used. And I don't know if I'm not sure if you can download that. We might be able to throw that on the website too for that if you want to try to write your own NRCS plan.